How many things, stories, experiences, rumors, or legends we have heard about cemeteries or pantheons that, by the way, if we stop to think a little bit more looking back in our timeline and in our present, we are the only species of the earth that, seriously, dedicates a great part of time, resources, and an endless number of ideas to be able to build in an adequate way, a dignified space and only destined for our eternal rest. How curious, but at the same time I suppose that this helps us to continue with a kind of cycle in our life. For example, to think that there is life after death is independent of each one. We must respect the beliefs of all, but what we are sure of is where we will stop once we have concluded this life cycle. Or well, maybe some urn for our ashes, in case we do not want to spend the rest of our eternity underground. Decision of each one. As mentioned in a part of a research project, Maria Lucia Fernandez, Oscar Assis, and Claudia Turturro, the grave is one of the first human monuments. There is no culture without a grave, nor is there a grave without culture. Without a doubt, these spaces will open the door to many aspects that we probably haven't given ourselves the time to appreciate when we visit a loved one or simply pass by. What architecture is, the history of the place, the different parts from where each soul that rests in these apparently quiet places comes from. And the more we think about those aspects that I mentioned to you, we get, yes, to think that each tomb, each mausoleum, crypt, the structure you like, in each one rests a different life story, a different type of energy, a beginning, development, and end different from each other, of course. And this leads us to stories that bring us together here today. Maybe physically those people are no longer with us, but what was left then in those cemeteries or pantheons? And to inaugurate this special night then, let's go with the first story that was shared with us by Javier Urdiales, who wrote to us from Jalisco, Mexico. This story is somewhat short, but my grandfather told me that he worked for many years in a cemetery. My grandfather told me that on a very cold night of a winter that does not remember the year, he was walking around the corridors of so many tombs. Something that was not really necessary, for it was a very quiet place and for so long no curious person entered that night pantheon. However, he did it so as not to fall asleep or get bored. Something to entertain himself at night, and between that walk, at one point in the night, in the distance, he saw a man walking slowly, without any hurry or stealth, who, recalls my grandfather, was only wearing a shirt and short pants. A tone that my grandfather says was totally different from the time of year in which he lived, because of course, the weather was so cold that night. My grandfather did not remember seeing that man enter the pantheon, so he shouted at him and the man turned immediately. "What are you doing here? Did you get lost?" asked my grandfather. "Yes, but I'm very cold. I'm looking for something warm, actually," the man replied, who looked very careless. My grandfather thought he was a vagabond who had gone out there in search of a warmer place, so my grandfather told him to follow him, to accompany him to shelter in his hut until dawn, which the man accepted. So my grandfather began to walk in front of him and began to ask him some questions such as where he was from or how he had entered. However, after a few steps he realized that that guy was no longer there, which at first my grandfather considered normal because perhaps the vagabond had escaped, thinking that my grandfather would call the police once they arrived at the house, but it was not my grandfather's intentions. The next day, my grandfather told the story to the guard of the day shift, who asked my grandfather to describe it as accurately as possible. And when he finished, the guard simply told him to accompany him, that they would go to a specific place in the pantheon. They walked just a little, and when they got there, they stood in front of a very nice but somewhat careless and dirty grave. In that grave, there was a showcase and a photograph. My grandfather came to see it, and what he saw in that photograph, he held his blood, because it was when he saw that he was the guy who had seen the previous night. However, the guard reassured him and told him that this was very normal and was due to the appearance of the grave, since in addition to being dirty, it did not have any arrangement or flower. The guard explained to my grandfather that sometimes souls feel so lonely, This is because they do not receive visits, and that is why they are sad at night. From then on, my grandfather took care of cleaning and bringing the flowers to the graves that required it. This during his turn. He never told me if he did it out of respect for the deceased or because he did not want to run into another again. Let's go with the second story of this night, which was written by Misael Torres. This that I am about to tell you happened to me many years ago, when I worked as a guard in a pantheon. Before I get into the story, it is necessary to explain to you that we were a total of 5 guards who worked in 2 shifts, 2 guards in each one, and one that covered the rest of the others. Besides that, we only had a small booth and there was only one bathroom, which was inside a mausoleum that was not far from there, the largest in the cemetery. In short, one night in particular I was doing a round as usual, when suddenly I got the urge to go to the bathroom. So I went to that mausoleum that I told you about. However, something was different. As I approached, I noticed that there was a light on, which was quite strange, since the mausoleum had none, and the bathroom could not be seen from the outside. So I got curious, and kept moving. It was strange, as I say, but it was not something that would take away my desire to attend to the call of nature, so to speak. As soon as I entered that mausoleum, I felt an overwhelming cold and suddenly, which surprised me even more because we were in summer and the nights were not precisely cold. I walked about 10 steps when I began to hear some voices and laughter, like children, which paralyzed me, and I ran immediately to look for my partner, who was at the entrance. Arriving, I told him what had happened, and we left right away. Honestly, he was a little more brave than me, and it's not that he was scary, but... well, probably a little, and more being already in that situation, now that I think about it. As expected, as we approached, and when we entered, we never saw that light, we did not hear any sound, nor did we feel that cold. However, we decided to investigate thoroughly, and we noticed that in that mausoleum there was a very wealthy family, which was made up of 2 young adults, a boy and a girl. As we approached where the girl was, we saw that her crypt was open, and underneath her was a doll, somewhat old. My partner and I turned around to see something scared, but I think more confused than anything. I picked it up, kept it, and closed its place, making sure it wouldn't open again. Finally, I went to the bathroom, my partner waited for me, and we both left. We barely took a few steps out of the mausoleum when we heard a very loud bang. And the laughter again, but with greater intensity. I shuddered from fear, and turned to see my partner, who with an expression of astonishment or terror in his face, only said to me, "I also heard it." So we both just let it go. What could we do anyway? We knew that there was no one alive in there, because we had just left and it's not like there was a lot of place to hide. We didn't go out again all night long. When our shift was over, while it was dawn, my partner and I took a look once more. And we realized that the doll was out again, but now farther than last time. We kept it again and left quickly. It was really very different to be in that place with the sunlight to be at night. That day I presented my resignation. I knew that something was not going to leave me alone. The third story of this night was written to us by Paulina Solano, from Costa Rica, in the municipality of Coronado. This that I lived was in the cemetery of Coronado. A little over 3 years ago, unfortunately, my brother passed away. And, in a way, that news was being anticipated by us, due to some complications in his health. But I think that even so, we are never really ready for the departure of a loved one. And no matter how much they have announced it to us, it will always surprise us. Because I think it's easy for anyone. When the funeral day came, I was very affected. A part of me was not that day. It is as I could describe it. So much so that I did not find out or know in what part of the cemetery it was where they had buried him. A few months after the funeral, I really felt a huge need to say goodbye to him as I should have, or as I would have liked at that time, and I already found a little better to do so. To which I was disposed to go to the cemetery, and for this a niece accompanied me, for she also wanted to give the last goodbye. I did have an idea of the part of the pantheon where it was buried, but still we could not give with the exact tomb. Already there we walked and walked, looking for one by one, reading every name of the buried people. And that's when we found a grave, in which there was no name written on it, and it wasn't as if time seemed to have erased it. No. It just didn't say anything. This made me very sad. Who will be buried here without a name? Poor thing, right? I told my niece. She only answered with a yes, a little discouraged. At that moment, we were sitting next to that tomb without a name, resting. And after a little while, I began to feel very distressed. I really don't know why, but I do know that I felt very strange. Adding to that, it was beginning to get dark and it seemed that it was going to rain soon, so I told her a little discouraged, that it would be better to leave. At least for that day we should leave him there. And when we got up to leave, we began to hear the voice of a woman. It was as if she were rolling a baby, one of those typical rolls that mothers make when they carry their baby so they can sleep. But we couldn't identify where it came from exactly. There was no one around. In fact, I was completely alone in that place. Something strange happened to us, but at least I didn't care so much at that moment. When after a short while of walking towards the exit, in another of those corridors of tombs and crypts, we heard her again. Just as close, but now it seemed to come from another direction, from another side. It was not very clear where, but I was sure it was not the same direction. We began to look around again, and it was when I asked my niece if she was listening. And while she turned her head everywhere, apparently also looking for the source of that sound, she answered that yes. We started walking, while I looked around for some kind of place or church where they were singing, or practicing the choir, or I don't know, something that could give an answer to that. And not much happened while we were walking, when, again, that voice that seemed to be still wriggling a baby, and it was there when I began to feel a lot of fear. Now it was real, and I told my niece that we had to hurry, that we did not know what could go with us from that cemetery, and that it seemed as if that was playing with us. We rushed out, and in that small section that was still missing, we couldn't stop listening. Until we left, and it was as if it suddenly went out. It did scare me, honestly. But that's true. I remember that for the most part. That sound gave me so much tranquility. In fact, it reminded me of the phrase you mention at the beginning of your videos, where you comment that some experience of this type can even generate calm. It scared me in the end, yes, as I mentioned, but a part of me was so calm that afternoon. Anyway, and despite the peace I felt, when we got home, my niece and I started praying, and then we made a cross on our foreheads with holy water. To prevent. We never know what happened in that place or moment. After a few days, he gave me to look for information about that cemetery, if there was any similar experience. And that's when I started a program of paranormal investigators, in which, within their reports in that cemetery, and almost at the end of that program, they had managed to capture a voice just like the one I heard that afternoon. But they didn't stay to look for that, or the origin. I never really knew what that was. And most importantly, if it represented a danger or the opposite. The next story of this night is written by Melissa Andrade. This story happened to me a few years ago with some friends, in that pantheon, in which it is closed today, in which I have not returned, nor do I plan to do so. It all started on the day we decided to go to one of the local pantheons in the city, and we got excited rather quickly, because some friends and I love all this paranormal stuff, and places with strange vibes or that contain legends. And after having heard a story from a teacher in those days of school, in which it was told that in that pantheon, in the background, and in one of the darkest parts of that cemetery, every night, some lights could be seen floating for a while, and supposedly they had no reason, they just appeared. And this was more than enough for my friends and I to agree to go one day. In total, we were not far away. And it was a night in which we really did not arrive so late. It was approximately 9 p.m., and we had been left to see the return of that place. When we were all ready, we ran off without much difficulty, and waited a few minutes in the indicated place, as the teacher had been very specific. That place had nothing special, in fact, but the contrast of the Pantheon's lighting was very noticeable due to the lack of light in that place, of public lighting and all that. And after those minutes of waiting, which were not many really, those lights appeared as we expected. It seemed as if it were a movie, in which what was told about that cemetery had to be fulfilled, but we were living it. They seemed to be 2 to 4 lights. They moved very little, to be honest. They were only there, apparently floating. We couldn't find any explanation for that. However, only a few moments of astonishment had passed by when, suddenly, a flock of birds that we did not know where they came from, went towards us and began to bite and bother us, so we ran away from there. We did not care about all the noise we made in that pantheon. The only thing we wanted and should do was get out of there quickly. Finally, and once out, we calmed down, although we were still a bit in shock about what we had just lived. I suppose it was expected, because we had never had a group of birds tell us that. So I said goodbye and got in my car, and at that same moment, I received a call from my mom, who told me that she was just talking to me because she had had a bad feeling, and the first thing that came to mind was me. I told her that I was fine, that I was already on my way home. In fact, obviously I was not going to tell her that we had entered a cemetery at night. I hung up the call, turned on my car, and when I turned on the lights, I realized that a car was coming at full speed with the lights off directly towards me. I was paralyzed, waiting for the worst. I closed my eyes and began to cry. All in just a few seconds, when, after those little moments, I opened my eyes suddenly. And I saw that there was nothing in front of me. I got out of my car quickly, and fortunately my friends were still there, outside the car of a friend, talking or I don't know. I got down quickly to tell them everything crying, but they didn't believe me, because they said they hadn't seen or heard anything in that time they were standing there on the street. Although I, on my side, was more than sure of what I had seen. When I got home, I was calmer, and I told her everything that had happened to my mother, who hugged me, and then told me that she had also heard about those lights, and that it was no coincidence what she had seen afterwards. Since many years ago a man in a state of drunkenness was driving with the lights off so that the police would not see him and fine him and all that, and he crashed in front of the cemetery, thus losing his life, and he told me that it is rumored that those lights that are on are those of that man, who lights them every night so that no one can experience the same thing again. The following story was shared by a person who preferred to remain anonymous. And after reading her experience when she wrote it to us, I understood the reasons. Let's get straight to the story. This that I am about to tell you, my best friend told me about it a long time ago. It was truly a very difficult event for her. But I think and suppose that after almost 10 years, she was able to tell me about it. It all starts with the brother of my best friend, whom we will call Miguel. He studied at the Faculty of Medicine, and as we well know, it is a school to which it is something difficult to enter, and that it is not cheap, precisely. I think that regardless of the place where this career is studied. Even so, he always combined his work with his studies so that money was always a less concern, or at least lightened the economic burden on his parents. And always strived to get good grades. However, the material for the internships and assignments is not only expensive, but sometimes it is also difficult to get. Well, depending on the place. And there came a point in his career when they started asking for material for certain assignments. That it was not at all easy to find them, to put them in context without giving much detail of the place or the story, since, in truth, my friend asked me not to tell anyone about this. Wow, that they could not relate it to some fact in a certain way. This was near Montemorelos, Monterrey and Linares, in Nuevo León, Mexico. And a friend of Miguel, whom we will call Diego, told him about some rumors that ran through the hallways of the school, in which they said that there was a subject who could get parts of bones, skulls, or even a complete skeleton. This at a truly affordable cost, compared to what it could cost in the city, but there was a risk in between, it was said, but still, Miguel accepted Diego's proposal and they began the search for this guy whom they had only heard of there, and whom they also only knew at that time that they were telling him Thomas. Then they would see what to do or ask what the risk was that they were talking about. After asking and asking how many people they might come across, they realized that it wasn't that easy to contact Tomas, and other companions only told them that what they were doing was not at all legal and that he was only looking to deal with serious people, and that therefore they assumed that it would not be like simply calling someone and that's it. After a few days of calls, and some money for God knows who, they finally met Thomas in person. It turns out that Thomas worked as the caretaker of a cemetery somewhat far from the city, one of the least popular and concordant, since he was generally designated for the lowest economic class of those directions. So the authorities did not pay much attention to him. So his treatment consisted of, for a modest amount of money, allowing young people, like the medical students, to enter at dawn to take some parts of the graves, something that had been done for years. The first meeting went wonderfully. However, there was a small detail that they could not go out or agree on. And it is that Thomas allowed them to enter any day of the week, with the exception of Sundays, as it was their only day off, and they would run more risk with the guard who covered them. But coincidentally, it was the only day that was made easy for Miguel, who was showing insistence. Because that amount of money that Tomas asked for, and the opportunity to get that material so easy, was unique, and he couldn't let it go. After insisting a lot on that talk, they reached an agreement, and with an extra amount of money. Tomas almost had no choice, and accepted the scoldings. He gave the boys the precise indications of how to enter, as well as of the specific graves that they could defile. Normally this would not be so, but since he was not going to be there, these indications were in areas where the guard could not find them. That same week, at 12 o'clock on Sunday, Miguel and Diego arrived at the cemetery. They did everything at the foot of the letter. They entered an area where you could climb a tree and jump that fence that surrounded the place. Really, that cemetery was completely alone. It was very big, that's for sure. And there was a very soft but cool wind that accompanied the overwhelming silence of that place. You might even doubt that there was actually someone taking care of the cemetery, because every step they took even sounded like they had some kind of amplifier on their feet. The silence was so overwhelming. They were equipped with what was necessary. Some lanterns, large backpacks, of course, black bags, and Tomas indicated an area to which they had no difficulty arriving. And given the conditions of those tombs, it would not be necessary such a large or complex tool to open those coffins almost exposed to the open air. However, as they entered more and more into that gloomy place, they began to feel observed. Although, of course, it is not like a recurring activity to do something illegal in a cemetery at midnight, so I suppose it was expected to feel that. But that did not explain the strange noises that were heard in the distance in some part of the Pantheon. And that place was not close to any colony or houses, so they assumed it would be some noise that had come from afar. It really didn't matter at this point, at least to Diego, because Miguel was very curious to know where those sounds came from or what caused them. It took a while for them to move everything carefully in those tombs, and without any setbacks, Miguel got what he was looking for. He had been lucky, in fact, to have found everything in the first tomb they opened, so he kept the material and was willing to accommodate everything to leave it as it was from the beginning. Meanwhile, Diego was still looking for something he needed, so Miguel ended up with his and only waited for him sitting on another tomb. While Diego continued with his search, Miguel did not stop looking where he believed those noises were heard. Miguel said, "Let me zoom in quickly and discreetly." Miguel said, "No, it's not going to take long." "Don't go to see Miguel," Diego replied, to which Miguel ignored and went over there stealthily. After half an hour, just when Diego finished and was ready to leave, he realized how long it had taken Miguel to return. So he hid things and headed to the place where that sound came from, which still followed. He walked for about 10 minutes, and the sounds intensified more and more. He began to notice that they were different voices, and even songs. As if there were a meeting, or a little more precisely, a mass. Also, they began to see lights in a multitude, until he arrived, and he was horrified when he noticed to see a circle of several people hooded with a black tunic, while other people behind them wore something similar to torches. This in itself was more than strange and disturbing, but the fact that they were in such a lonely pantheon that it was almost in the middle of nowhere was what ended up leaving Diego more than stunned. He approached politely as he could, trying not to make any sound, when suddenly he saw that everyone had formed, to give way to a man with a goat head on his shoulders, in front of which everyone knelt. Diego could not believe what he was seeing, when suddenly a sound was heard away from all that circle, and he saw in the distance that two other men in the same dress kept Miguel in their arms. Diego drowned a scream with so much difficulty caused by the terror he felt by the every drop of his blood. However, everyone in that circle noticed and turned immediately. So Diego began to run quickly. That frozen blood had become a liquid that boiled through all his veins, and which helped him run as fast as he could between the darkness of that pantheon. He swore that they were following him, it was more than safe, but he could not run at the risk of turning, and by accident he fell into a grave and lost consciousness. The next day, Diego woke up in a hospital room, without injuries, except for a small hit to the head. Nothing to worry about. No one knows who took him. And at that moment, his parents were in that room with him. Upon regaining complete knowledge, he began to tell them everything, and fortunately their parents did not hesitate in what he was telling them. So when they saw that their son was well and that apart he had never been in trouble, they took him to the police station to file a complaint against that incident, as well as Miguel's disappearance. Who, of course, I had called that day by phone, but the call never came in, and in his house they didn't know anything about him either. Days passed and the officers almost forced Diego to go and declare on different occasions, which was quite suspicious. In addition to the fact that every time Diego returned from this, he came as someone cold, distant and very serious, as if something had been done to him. Until finally, they say, Diego lost his heart and he didn't talk to anyone else. The parents thought it was because of the trauma that generated the experience. However, there are those who believe that Diego discovered a cult to which he was protected by the authorities, which tried to silence the case by making Diego look like a madman, while they never talked about Miguel's disappearance. And Tomas was never told again. The following experience, like the previous one, was written and shared by a person who prefers to remain anonymous. And the story is this. My parents ran a cemetery for 10 years. I had 6 siblings, so at some point in our lives each one of us had to help them. On the occasions that I had, nothing paranormal or strange happened to me, except once, which is the one I would like to tell you today. On one occasion, my mother and I had to enter a new bank for the small chapel that the Pantheon had. We wanted to do it as soon as possible, since it was very hot those days. However, there were several problems with our truck, so that day was very late. The next day, my mother had an appointment with the doctor, and the next days there would be a forecast for an intense rain, so I promised to put the bench on my own account the next day, early, so that the rain would not reach me. I went to 7 a.m., and everything looked like usual. Doing all the movement took me at least 2 hours, moving other furniture, putting them back together, and everything. And I finished. But I decided to go for some water to clean myself before closing the chapel and leaving the place. When I returned, I realized that there was a girl in a red dress. Which seemed normal to me, because the entrance to the public was at 8 a.m., although I sincerely thought of closing the Pantheon, because I thought that no one was going to go for the forecast of time. So I thought that girl was accompanying her parents, but she would have separated from them to find something to have fun with while, or I don't know, so I didn't bother her or tell her anything. I better go to the truck to have lunch before I leave. It took some time when my mother arrived at the cemetery, who was surprised that I was there. We talked a little. I told her about the bench that I had already been able to put in, and then I told her about the girl and her parents that I had not seen. Which made me immediately wonder if the girl was wearing a red dress, and I replied that yes, it was strange for me to ask something so precisely because I had not seen my mother enter the cemetery before arriving with me, and after I answered, with a quiet voice, he told me that before they obtained the Pantheon, they had told them that a family had come there with their daughter to visit their relatives. However, the daughter had separated for a moment to explore and see the tombs, but no one ever found her anywhere. They never knew about her. When she told me this, I got annoyed because she hadn't told me before. I could have saved myself that moment. That was so strange. Well, now it had been strange and I was starting to get scared. But she replied that she needed help with that and I was the only one available. And that if she told me something like that, she would know that I would not go. In addition to that, he told me that the girl appears to him supposedly to those who do not know his story, those who are not afraid of him, and spend a little time with her, even if it is from afar. After that, I continued to go to help my parents at the cemetery, but I never went alone again, nor did I see her again. The following experience of this night was shared with us by Andres Reyna, who wrote to us from Jalisco, Mexico. I worked in a cemetery a long time ago, where I always did my best to avoid the night shift. I made up excuses. I missed or sometimes bribed my colleagues for not taking that shift. Seriously, I didn't want to. But on one occasion I had to go. I knew it was a matter of time. I prepared myself mentally, since I was actually afraid of her. My companions told me that everything was very quiet, and that if I did not think of strange things, I would not suggest it, and I would not have a bad time. However, one of my colleagues, the one who spent most of his time working there, in fact, told me that in case he heard any noise, he would ignore it, since it could be the trees, leaves moving with the air, or some animal, which was the most normal thing. That he thought that those same noises could happen anywhere in the city at any time, with people or without people. But in case it were something else, that I was sure it wasn't all that, what I could do best would be to stay in the little room we had in the closet. Finally the time came. I was scared to death, really, but I tried hard not to think about it. I even carried several things to distract myself, such as a book, a magazine, among other things that I knew would keep me busy or distracted on that shift. Part of my work was to make various rondes. However, I decided to only make the necessary ones, which would be only between 3 or 4 at night. The first rounds surprised me, not having felt the fear I might have expected. It was very quiet, in fact, as they told me. It was just dark and that's it. I didn't go over there. But when I found myself on the third lap, I began to feel observed. As if someone was following me with their eyes at a distance. Even so, I followed the advice of my companions, and I tried seriously not to think about it. I had suggested, I thought, so I finished saying rondin and I went quickly to the casita. A couple of hours passed when I was already in the casita, and suddenly, I felt an icy air that ran through the whole place, making a contrast with the heat of that night. I went out of the closet a little to stretch my legs and look around, convincing myself that the night was not so bad, but from one moment to another, I heard some very abrupt movements, as if something or someone was running at full speed through the darkness. It was very strange, because I could not see anything. And suddenly, that sound stopped, just for another to start listening, as if someone started moving dirt from the ground. Until a very loud shriek echoed throughout the cemetery. Normally I would have stayed in the booth as they told me, but upon hearing the scream of a person, I didn't hesitate to go towards where the sound came from, as if my body was moving automatically. My legs were moving forward as I was barely processing what had just happened. When I got to the place where that noise came from, I turned on my lamp, and contrary to all the adrenaline I felt as I ran, I was paralyzed. When I got to the source of that noise, what I saw on the ground, on a tomb in a hall in the Pantheon, was not an animal or human. That is, she looked like a person, only longer, covered in hair, and her head was like a buffalo's. She had big horns and eyes completely red despite the darkness. That thing. He looked at me and screamed. It was a scream that I will never, seriously, ever forget in my life. And just remembering it at the time of writing this makes my skin itch. It was very heartbreaking, seriously. I had never heard anything like this before. So I stood still and that thing just left. With just a jump, he jumped off the fence of the cemetery and headed towards a forest that was behind the Pantheon. After what I'm sure of, it was a few minutes, I reacted, and I saw that that thing had been lying on a grave. One in which there were all kinds of strange things, like those they put to do witchcraft. There were jars with photos, remains of what seemed to be a black hen, among other very strange things, and I understood that I was not lying on that, but that thing had been digging that grave for some strange reason. I didn't know how I spent the whole night, but the next day I explained everything that had happened to my boss, who, I don't know if he believed me, but he took it very calmly and only told me to go to rest, without telling me anything else. When I was leaving, my partner intercepted me, the one who had the most time there. When he saw me so disturbed, he invited me to a coffee and explained to me what he had seen. He told me that sometimes they do witchcraft to some dead so that they do not rest in peace. They make deals with entities or demons to annoy them. That scream I heard was from who was in that tomb. That it had been a cry for help from that horrible being who was there. Also, according to him, the reason why he didn't do anything to me was because that thing was there only to carry out his mission with the dead. He had no interest in me. After that day I got closer to religion and investigated these phenomena. I learned some things and now I feel more secure in a way. I don't work there anymore, but I've lost the fear of entities like these, I guess, since that night was when I discovered that just as there is evil, there is good. The next experience of this night was shared with us by Christina Romo. What I'm going to tell you is something short. I live in a colony in which there is a pantheon in the center. It is not as big as the others, that's for sure. However, it is striking, at least for me, that it is in a place like this, although I have seen others that are also inside colonies. But this does not prevent strange things from happening. In this pantheon worked a guard during the night shift, whom we all wanted. His name was Federico, Don Fede, as we called him. He was a very kind and attentive man. He even let us sometimes be more time inside the cemetery. Even if it was time to close, when he got bored he would take a walk outside too, and he would watch the whole neighborhood, among other things. Also, the neighbors were very nice to him. Sometimes they would take him a taco to dinner. In cold weather they would give him coffee, and they would always remember his birthday. They really loved him a lot, and he loved them. Time passed, and Don Fede stopped working there because his health got worse, until he unfortunately died. During this time, one of my neighbors had been on vacation, so no one wanted to give him the terrible news. Until my mother was in charge of doing it. That's how important it was for the Don Fede colony. However, what was her surprise when the wife of that marriage answered my mother that they would not play with that they had just seen him giving his round the night before, and that they had even greeted him from afar. My mother did not know what to answer, and the woman did not know what to think or say, this seeing the reaction of my mother. It was clear that it was not a joke. As the nights progressed, the neighbors continued to have more sightings of Don Fede in the cemetery. He looked normal, happy, calm. He was doing his job, so we all accept it and see him from time to time. In the distance. Something curious about this is that this cemetery has had various workers, none of whom claim to have seen him. They only see the neighbors smiling at nothing, greeting who knows who, they say. It's curious. What more can we say about the pantheons? Without a doubt, each experience that they have written to us is different from one another. We never know what to expect, because, as we said at the beginning, each grave is a different life story, and many of them have not yet ended.